The auctioneer's chant was a merciless rhythm, a drumbeat for the death of a man's dream. It echoed off the big blue harvest ore silo and bounced across the muddy farmyard, each syllable a hammer blow, driving another nail into Richard Davenport's coffin. I stood near the back, by an old fuel barrel, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket. It was a cold, damp day in the fall of '82, the kind of day that seeps into your bones and reminds you that winter is coming, one way or another. The crowd was a mix of neighbors, vultures, and the merely curious. They picked over the remnants of Davenport's ambition like crows on a fresh roadkill. Disc harrows, planters, grain wagons, all of it gleaming, barely a season's dust on the paint, all of it bought on the bank's dime. And now, the bank was taking it back, piece by painful piece. The main event was parked in the center of the yard, a monument to hubris, a Steiger Panther III, its lime green paint still bright, the tires as tall as a man. Four-wheel drive, articulated steering, a Cummins engine that could pull the devil himself out of hell. It was the biggest tractor in 3 counties, and when Davenport had brought it home 5 years earlier, he'd paraded it down Main Street like a conquering hero. He'd leaned out of that enormous cab, waving and grinning, the very picture of modern, progressive farming. He'd even had the gall to stop in front of my place, idle that big diesel, and shout over the rumble, "Hey Frank, time to trade in that old 2-cylinder junk and get with the program." I hadn't said a word. I just kept turning the wrench on the injector line of my 1968 John Deere 4020. My junk. Paid for. Every nut, every bolt. Now that same Steiger sat silent, a green monster with a paper tag slapped on its grill by the auctioneer's clerk. The tag read, Lot 47, but in the unforgiving language of the farm crisis, it might as well have said, scrap. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Miller, was working the crowd up. "All right, folks, here's the big one. The pride of the fleet. Who'll start the bidding on this magnificent machine? Do I hear 50,000? $50,000 for a tractor that was over 100 grand new just a few years ago. Who'll give me 50? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the machine shed. $50,000 was a king's ransom now. Interest rates were scraping the sky at 18, 20%. Corn was under $2 a bushel. Land values, which had been the foundation of all that borrowing, had fallen through the floor. The program Davenport had been so proud of had turned out to be a trap. I saw him then. Richard Davenport. He was standing off by himself, leaning against the very silo his borrowed money had built. He was thinner than I remembered, his face pale and drawn. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a man carrying a weight no machine could pull. His wife wasn't there. I heard she'd taken the kids and gone back to her parents in the city. The auctioneer dropped his price. 40,000 then. Come on, boys, this is a steal. 40,000. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no hands went up. The local bank president, Mr. Abernathy, stood beside the auctioneer, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He'd been the one who'd signed the loans, who'd encouraged Davenport to get big or get out. Now he was just overseeing the liquidation. I wasn't here to gloat. There's no joy in watching another man fall, no matter how arrogant he'd been. I was here because I'd heard a rumor that a small 6-row cultivator was on the block, and mine was getting worn. I figured I could pick it up for cash if the bidding stayed low. Davenport's eyes scanned the crowd, a desperate, hunted look in them. They settled on me. He pushed himself off the silo and started walking my way, his boots sucking at the mud. The crowd parted for him, a silent, awkward gesture of respect for the condemned. He stopped a few feet in front of me. His fancy insulated coveralls were stained with grease and dirt, as if he'd been trying to single-handedly hold his empire together with a wrench and a prayer. "You came to watch the show, Frank?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Just looking for a cultivator, Rich," I said, keeping my tone even. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "A cultivator? Of course. Something you can pay for with the change in your pocket, I suppose." He gestured with a sweep of his arm at the silent green Steiger. "You always thought I was a fool, didn't you? Talking about me down at the coffee shop? Old man Miller, stuck in the past with his rusty iron." "I never said a word about you, Rich. Not one." And that was the truth. It wasn't my way. "You didn't have to," he spat. "You just sat there with that damned, self-satisfied look on your face, while you paid for your coffee with a wrinkled dollar bill, while the rest of us were building something. We were feeding the world, that's what they told us. The government, the bankers, the university experts. Fence row to fence row. Expand or die." His voice cracked on the last words. He looked back at the tractor, then at Abernathy, who refused to meet his gaze. "They promised us the moon," he whispered, more to himself than to me, "and all we got was the bill." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, the cold wind whipping around us. The auctioneer had given up on the Steiger for now, and moved on to a smaller disc. His chant started up again, the rhythm of ruin. Rich looked at my old Ford pickup parked by the road, the one I'd owned for 15 years. Then he looked back at me, his eyes hollow. "How'd you do it, Frank? How do you know?" "I didn't know anything," I said honestly. I don't like owing anybody. My dad taught me that. If you can't hold it in your hand, you don't own it. The bank owns it." He shook his head slowly, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "My dad taught me to listen to the experts." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a ghost at his own funeral. I stood there for a long time, watching the auction grind on. They eventually sold the Steiger. A big corporate farm outfit from out of state got it for $32,000, a fraction of what Rich owed on it. As they loaded it onto a lowboy trailer, its engine silent, its purpose gone, I couldn't help but think about the two paths we'd taken. His, paved with credit and promises of a glorious future. Mine, a dusty, well-worn track of caution and calloused hands. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. As you listen to this, think about your own life, your own work. Have you ever been in a situation like that, where everyone around you is chasing the new, shiny thing, telling you you're a fool for sticking with the old, reliable way? Let me know in the comments what you did. Did you hold your ground like Frank? Or did you jump on the bandwagon with Rich? There's no right or wrong answer, just the path you choose and the consequences that follow. The story of how Richard Davenport ended up in that muddy yard really began about 8 years earlier, back in '74. Times were good then. Unbelievably good. Richard Nixon had opened up trade with the Russians, and they were buying American grain by the boatload. Prices shot through the roof. For the first time in a generation, it felt like a young man could really make a fortune farming. That was the year my 40-20 decided to eat its clutch. It was the middle of May. The ground was just right for planting corn, and I was about halfway through the back 80 when the pedal went soft. I pushed it to the floor, and nothing happened. The tractor kept rolling, but the power from that big 6-cylinder diesel wasn't reaching the wheels. I knew immediately what it was. The clutch plate was shot. A groan escaped my lips. There was no good time for a breakdown, But this was about the worst. Every day you lose in planting season in the spring, you lose on the other end in the fall. I limped it back to the machine shed, the transmission grinding in protest. The thought of calling the John Deere dealership in town flickered through my mind. They could have a mechanic out here, have it split, and a new clutch in it in a day or two. But the bill would be astronomical. Hundreds of dollars I didn't have to spare. So I did what my father had always done. I set to fixing it myself. For the next 3 days, my world shrank to the space under that tractor. I blocked the front end securely with heavy oak timbers. I disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness, the hydraulic hoses, the steering column. Everything had to be labeled with little tags of masking tape, so I'd remember where it went. I drained the transmission oil, the thick, honey-colored fluid smelling of hot metal and years of hard work. Then came the hard part, splitting it. Using 2 heavy-duty floor jacks and a chain hoist from the rafters, I slowly, carefully rolled the front half of the tractor, engine, front axle and all, away from the back half. It was heavy, greasy, knuckle-busting work. Every bolt was tight, caked with a mixture of dirt and oil that was damn near concrete. I had a 1/2-inch drive socket set my dad had bought after the war, and I put my whole body into the breaker bar, my muscles screaming as a bolt would finally groan and give way with a sharp crack. On the second day, Richard Davenport drove into the yard. He was farming the quarter section next to mine, land he'd just cash rented at a price that made my eyes water. He pulled up in his shiny new Chevrolet pickup, the V8 rumbling with an easy power. He was driving a brand new International Harvester, 1066, its red paint glowing in the sun, a 12-row planter hitched behind it. He was planting more in an hour than I could in half a day. He swaggered over to the shed, a cup of coffee from the diner still in his hand. He peered in at the dissected 4020, its guts exposed to the world. "Looks like you got some trouble there, Frank," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Clutch went out," I grunted, not looking up from a particularly stubborn bolt on the bell housing. "You know the dealer would have that done for you by now," he offered. "Time is money, you know, especially this time of year." "I've got more time than money," I said, finally getting the bolt to break loose. I wiped a greasy hand across my forehead, leaving a black streak. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Suit yourself. But you can't make 1970s money with 1960s iron. The bank's loaning money for next to nothing. Abernathy down at Farmers Trust told me himself. Rich, he said, we want to invest in progressive operators like you. I'm picking up another 160 acres next week. Gonna need a bigger tractor soon. Maybe one of them new 4-wheel drive Steigers." He looked at my greasy hands, my old tractor in pieces, and I could see the pity in his eyes. Or maybe it was contempt. To him, I was a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era, too stubborn or too scared to embrace the future. "Well, good luck with that, Rich," I said, turning my attention back to the work. "Yeah," he said, draining his coffee cup and tossing it on the ground. "You too, Frank. You're gonna need it." He walked back to his pickup and drove off, leaving me in a cloud of dust and the lingering smell of his smug superiority. For a moment, I'll admit, a sliver of doubt crept into my mind. The sun was beating down. My back ached. Every muscle protested. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool, breaking my back to save a few $100 while the world passed me by. Then I looked at my tractor. I knew every inch of it. I knew the particular whine the hydraulics made when the oil was cold. I knew the exact spot on the throttle to set it for the perfect idle. I had paid for it with 5 years of sweat and careful saving. It was mine. That feeling, the simple, solid weight of ownership, was something I wasn't sure Richard Davenport, with all his bank loans and shiny paint, would ever truly understand. I picked up my wrench, found a fresh spot of leverage, and went back to work. The community, for the most part, sided with Davenport. At the co-op elevator, waiting to unload my meager first cutting of hay, the talk was all about expansion. "Here Davenport picked up the old Johnson place," one farmer would say, leaning against a dusty bag of seed corn. "Yep, paid top dollar for it, too," another would reply. "But you got to spend money to make money. He'll have it paid off in 2 good years with these prices." They'd nod in agreement. Then, one of them might catch my eye. "How's that old deer running, Frank? Still holding together?" The question was friendly enough on the surface, but the undertone was clear. I was the local cautionary tale, the man who refused to get on the gravy train. I'd just nod. "She runs fine. Does the job." And she did. I got the new clutch in, bolted the 40/20 back together, and filled her up with fresh oil. When I turned the key, the diesel engine coughed to life with a puff of black smoke, and then settled into its familiar, powerful rhythm. The sound was sweeter than any music. I finished my planting only a few days late. It was a constant battle, though. My 6-row planter against Davenport's 12-row. My old, smaller combine against his brand new one with the air-conditioned cab. He could do in a day what took me 3. He hired a man to help him. I had my wife, Sarah, driving the grain wagon, and my son David, who was just a boy, helping with chores after school. We worked from sunup to sundown, and often long after. Sarah never complained, but I'd see her at the kitchen table late at night, poring over the account books, her brow furrowed with worry. We were making it, but just barely. There was no room for error, no room for a major breakdown or a bad crop. We were walking a tightrope, while Richard Davenport was flying a jet. The boom years of the late 70s were a fevered dream. It seemed like the good times would never end. Corn hit $3, then $3.50. Soybeans went to $7, then $8 a bushel. Land that had sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was now being appraised at $2,000, then $2,500. It was paper wealth, a magical inflation that made everyone feel like a genius. And no one felt more like a genius than Richard Davenport. He made good on his promise. He bought the Steiger Panther. I remember the day the semi-truck hauled it into his yard. It was enormous, an alien green machine that dwarfed everything around it. He took delivery of a new, bigger combine, too, a Gleaner N6 with a fancy rotary design. He tore down his old farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style house with a 2-car garage. A new Cadillac sedan de ville for his wife sat in the driveway. He was the king of the county. When he walked into the diner for coffee, men would stop talking and listen to what he had to say. He talked about hedging on the futures market, about tax depreciation strategies, about leveraging assets to acquire more assets. It was a new language, and he was its most fluent speaker. He and Abernathy, the bank president, were thick as thieves, often seen having lunch together, drawing plans on napkins. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. The good prices were a godsend for us too. But instead of leveraging, I did the opposite. I took the extra profit from a good year in '77 and paid off the last of the operating loan I'd had for seed and fertilizer. It was a small note, just a few $1,000s, but paying it off felt like shrugging off a mountain. I walked out of the Farmers' Trust Bank that day, feeling 10 feet tall. Abernathy had been polite, but dismissive. He was busy drawing up a $1 million expansion loan for Davenport. My small account was barely worth his time. Sarah and I didn't build a new house. We put a new roof on the old one. We didn't buy a new car. I replaced the worn-out engine in our 10-year-old station wagon myself. The biggest splash I made was buying a used John Deere 7700 combine. It was a good machine, a step up from my old one, but it was still 5 years old. I drove 300 miles to look at it, spent a whole day going over it with a fine-tooth comb, and then paid the man in cash. The farmer I bought it from was selling it to buy a brand new one. "Gotta keep up," he'd said, shaking his head at my wad of $100 bills. "The bank's offering great terms." My neighbors thought I was crazy, insane. Here was the golden age of agriculture, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get rich, and Frank Miller was acting like it was still the Great Depression. "Frank, what are you doing?" My neighbor to the east, a good man named Tom, asked me one day over the fence line. "You could buy that 80 acres behind you. Abernathy would give you the loan in a heartbeat. You could double your operation." "And I'd double my debt," I said, tamping down some new fence staples. "But the land values, they're only going up. It's a sure thing." "Nothing's a sure thing, Tom," I said, "except death and taxes, and the fact that the bank always gets its money back." He just shook his head and walked away, muttering about how some people just didn't have the stomach for business. The talk in town was that I was scared, that my father's struggles in the 50s had left me permanently spooked, unable to take a risk. Maybe they were right. I remembered my dad sitting at the same kitchen table Sarah now used, his head in his hands, worrying about a $500 note on a new plow. The memory of that worry was etched into me deeper than any brand on a steer. I had promised myself I would never put my family, my land, through that kind of fear. So while Davenport's empire grew, mine stayed the same size, solid, secure, and, in the eyes of the world, a complete and utter failure. He was the future. I was a fossil. The first hint that the music was about to stop came not from the fields, but from the radio. It was the summer of '79. I was in the machine shed, grinding a valve on the old Farmel M we used for odd jobs. Paul Harvey was on the radio, his familiar voice a comforting presence in the dusty shop. He was talking about something happening back east, in Washington. A new man in charge of the Federal Reserve, another Paul Volcker. He was talking about fighting inflation, about something called tightening the money supply. It was all abstract, a world away from my greasy hands and the smell of grinding compound. But one phrase stuck with me: unprecedented increases in interest rates. Later that week, a letter came from the bank. It was a form letter, full of dry, official language. It was a notification that, due to new federal policies, all agricultural loans would now be subject to variable interest rates. I read it, folded it, and put it in the drawer with my paid-in-full receipts. It didn't affect me. I didn't have any loans. But I remember looking across the road that night. Davenport's whole farm was lit up like a small city. Yard lights on tall poles cast a sterile white glow over everything. His new Steiger was parked near the house, and I could hear the hum of the block heater already plugged in, keeping the big diesel ready for an early start. It was a picture of success, of overwhelming power and prosperity. But standing there in my own quiet darkness, looking at that island of artificial daylight built entirely on borrowed money and a variable interest rate, I felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. The air was warm and humid, but for the first time in a long time I felt a chill, the first cold wind of a long, hard winter that was still just over the horizon. The change came in the winter of 1980. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. It was meant to be a grand political statement, a punishment for their invasion of Afghanistan. But for us, standing in the frozen fields of the Midwest, It was a death sentence. The bottom dropped out of the market overnight. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of all that borrowing, all that expansion, plummeted. It was like the world had tilted on its axis. The bankers who had been so eager to lend money, slapping farmers on the back and calling them the backbone of America, suddenly grew cold. Abernathy stopped making his friendly visits to the diner. The easy credit dried up, and the variable interest rates on those massive loans began to climb, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. 12%, 15%, 18%. That spring was dry. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue for weeks on end. The rich black soil I'd turned over with my old moldboard plough turned to dust. When I'd walk the fields, it would puff up around my boots in little grey clouds. We planted, praying for rain. But none came. The young corn sprouted, thin and pale green, then just stopped, struggling to survive in the parched earth. I saw the strain on everyone. In town, men walked with their shoulders hunched, their faces grim. The usual easy banter at the co-op was replaced by hushed, anxious conversations about the price of fuel, the cost of money, the mercilessly clear sky. Richard Davenport seemed immune at first. He drove his big Steiger harder than ever, pulling a massive field cultivator that stirred up colossal clouds of dust, trying to force a crop out of the ground through sheer horsepower. But the swagger was gone. I saw him one afternoon at the parts store, his face ashen. He was arguing with the man behind the counter about the price of a set of injector nozzles for the Steiger. $1,000 for 6 nozzles? That's robbery, he was shouting, his voice tight with panic. That's the price, Rich, the parts man said calmly. Cummins parts. They got to come from the factory. Davenport threw a greasy rag on the counter and stormed out. He was beginning to understand a truth I'd learned long ago. The more complex the machine, the more it owns you. My 4020 had simple, mechanical injectors I could rebuild myself on a workbench for a few dollars in parts. His required a specialist and a second mortgage. The breaking point came in June. A line of thunderstorms finally appeared on the horizon, dark and promising. But they brought no gentle soaking rain. They brought wind, a hot, dry wind that picked up the topsoil and hurled it eastward. For 2 days, the sky was brown. The sun was a dull red disk. It was like living through the plagues of Egypt. When it was over, my fields were scoured, the young corn shredded and buried. But I still had my soil. I had planted windbreaks of cedar and multiflora rose 30 years ago, just like my dad had taught me. They held the worst of it back. Davenport wasn't so lucky. He had torn out all his fence rows, all his windbreaks, to make room for his massive equipment. Wasted acres, he'd called them. His fields were flat, black, and exposed. The wind had a clear run for miles. It peeled the topsoil from his land like a skinning knife, piling it in drifts against the road ditches. He lost years of fertility in a single afternoon. A few days later, I was fixing a fence along the road that separated our properties. I saw the Steiger sitting in the middle of his field, silent. It sat there the next day, and the day after. On the 3rd day, a service truck from the big diesel shop over in the city was parked beside it. I watched from a distance as 2 mechanics in clean coveralls worked on it, their heads buried in the engine compartment. Later that evening, Tom, my neighbor, stopped by. His face was long. "You hear about Rich?" he asked. "Saw the service truck," I said. "Through a rod," Tom said, shaking his head. "Right through the side of the block. He was pushing it too hard in that dry ground, trying to make up for lost time. They say the engine's toast, a complete rebuild. They're talking $20,000. $20,000. It was more than I'd paid for my whole farm. "He doesn't have it," Tom whispered, as if the wind might carry the words to the bank. Abernathy turned him down for another loan, told him he was overextended. The cracks were no longer hidden. The foundation of Richard Davenport's empire was crumbling to dust, just like his topsoil. He had flown too close to the sun, and his wings, built of credit and steel, were melting away. I looked at my own fields, damaged but intact. I looked at my machine shed, where my old, paid-for tractor sat waiting. I felt no joy, no sense of victory, just a deep and profound sadness. The program had failed, the promises were lies, and a good man, an ambitious man, was about to be broken on the wheel of progress. The fall of 1981 was a season of ghosts. Combines sat silent in the fields, their headers pointed at stunted, worthless crops. The price of corn was so low it barely paid for the fuel to harvest it. The interest rate, the number that now governed all our lives, crept past 20%. It was a monstrous, insatiable thing, devouring equity, devouring hope, devouring men's souls. Every tick of the clock was the sound of another dollar of interest being added to a debt that could never be repaid. Foreclosure notices started appearing in the legal section of the county newspaper. At first, it was just a few unfamiliar names from the far side of the county. Then, the names got closer. Men I knew. Men I'd had coffee with. Each notice was a small obituary for a family's dream. Richard Davenport fought it as long as he could. He sold off some cattle at a loss. He tried to get a second job driving a truck, but there was no work. The whole economy was seizing up. His new brick house grew quiet. The Cadillac disappeared one day, replaced by a beat-up old sedan. His wife and kids were gone. The rumor was she couldn't take the stress anymore. The constant, ringing phone calls from creditors, the hollow look in her husband's eyes. I saw him one day in town, coming out of the bank. It was the same bank where he and Abernathy had once drawn up their grand plans on napkins. He didn't see me. His face was a mask of despair, his eyes fixed on the pavement, as if he couldn't bear to look at the world he had once sought to conquer. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 2. Abernathy had likely just delivered the final blow. Our own year was hard. The harvest was less than half of what it should have been. But we survived. Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table one November night, the account book open between us. The numbers were grim, written in her neat, careful hand. The income column was frighteningly small, but the expense column was manageable. No tractor payments, no land payments, no crippling interest chewing away at us while we slept. We paid our property taxes. We bought our groceries. We put enough diesel in the tank for the next spring. At the bottom of the page, after all the subtractions, was a small black number. We had made a profit, a few $100s. In the fall of 1981, a few $100s of black ink was a miracle. Sarah closed the book and put her hand on mine. Her fingers were rough from her garden and from helping me in the shop, but her touch was gentle. "We're going to be all right, Frank," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I know," I said. And I did. We were like an old oak tree, not as tall or as flashy as some, but our roots were deep. We were grounded in the solid earth of self-sufficiency, and the storm could not pull us down. The day of Davenport's auction arrived cold and grey. It was the final, public humiliation. The day the vultures would pick the bones clean. As I stood there in the mud, watching it all unfold, watching the life he had built be dismantled piece by piece, I didn't feel vindication. I felt a shared sorrow. He had been arrogant, yes. He had been condescending. but he was still one of us. He was a farmer who loved the land and had been betrayed by a system that promised him the world and then snatched it all away. When his confrontation with me was over and he walked away into the crowd, a ghost at his own funeral, I stayed. I wasn't just there for a cultivator anymore. I was there to bear witness. The auctioneer moved on to the smaller items: hand tools, welders, air compressors, the things a man uses to build and repair, the very tools of his independence. They were going for pennies on the dollar. A group of men were gathered around a heavy-duty rolling toolbox, the kind a serious mechanic owns. It was full of good-quality wrenches, sockets, and pliers. Davenport's personal tools. "All right, boys, what am I bid for the whole box and caboodle?" the auctioneer chanted. "A lifetime of tools right here. Who'll give me $500? Silence. 400. 300. I saw Davenport standing near the machine shed, watching. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching that toolbox. It was probably the first thing he'd ever bought when he started farming, the one thing he'd paid for with his own cash. It was the last piece of his old self. $200. Do I hear 200? A man bid 150. I've got 150. Who'll give me 175? Before I knew what I was doing, my hand was in the air. 200, I said, my voice louder than I intended. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction. I got 200 from Frank Miller. Who'll go 2 1/4? The other bidder shook his head. Sold, the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at me. For $200 to Mr. Miller. I walked over to the clerk, pulled 4 $50 bills from my wallet, and paid her. Then I walked over to the toolbox. It was heavy. I grabbed the handle and started pulling it through the mud, toward my truck. As I passed the machine shed, Davenport stepped out of the shadows. He just stood there, looking at me, then at the toolbox. His face was unreadable. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. A man's got to have his tools, Rich, I said quietly. I didn't stop. I just kept pulling it toward the road. I knew he had nowhere to put it, no shop to call his own. But that wasn't the point. I wasn't going to let them take everything from him. The climax of the day, of course, was the land. After the equipment was gone, a man from the sheriff's office tacked a notice to the side of the barn. They were selling the farm itself, all 480 acres, including the original 80 that had been in the Davenport family for 100 years. The crowd grew quiet. This was the true death. A machine is just iron, but the land is a legacy. Abernathy stood with the sheriff, his face like stone. He was there to bid on behalf of the bank, to reclaim the collateral. An out-of-state investment group was there, too, represented by a man in a clean suit and shiny shoes who looked like he'd never seen a dirt road in his life. They started the bidding. The man in the suit made the first offer, a lowball number that was an insult to the generations of work that had gone into that farm. Abernathy countered. They went back and forth, the numbers climbing, but still staying well below what the land had been worth just a few years earlier. The local farmers stood silent, their pockets empty, unable to do anything but watch as another piece of their community was carved up and sold to strangers. I had come with a purpose. Sarah and I had talked about it for weeks. We had savings. Not a lot, but enough. It was the money we had carefully put away during the good years, the money we hadn't spent on new paint or bigger engines. The bidding stalled. The man in the suit had the high bid. The sheriff was about to close it. Wait, I said. Every head turned toward me. Abernathy looked at me with disbelief. The man in the suit looked annoyed. I want to bid, I said, my heart pounding. But not on the whole thing. I want to bid on the original 80 acres, the homestead, The sheriff looked at Abernathy, who gave a slight, irritated nod. The law said they had to offer the parcels separately, if there was a bidder. "All right," the sheriff said. "Bidding is now open on the 80-acre parcel, described as the Davenport homestead." The man in the suit wasn't interested in such a small piece. Abernathy, on behalf of the bank, put in a low bid, the amount still owed on that specific parcel. I took a deep breath. "I bid $10,000 over the bank's bid," I said clearly. "Cash." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a strong offer. Abernathy looked at me, his eyes narrowing. He was calculating. He knew the bank would get the rest of the land. He knew fighting me on this small piece would just be for spite, and it might look bad. After a long, tense moment, he shook his head. "The bank declines to raise its bid," he said. The sheriff looked at me. "Going once, going twice, sold, to Frank Miller." I had just bought the heart of my rival's fallen kingdom. The years that followed were lean, but the fever had broken. The farm crisis bottomed out, and slowly, painfully, began to recede. The lessons learned were brutal. We lost a lot of good people. Some moved away to the cities, their farms sold to corporations or to neighbors who had managed to hang on. The term progressive farmer was no longer a compliment. It was a bitter joke. The new words were sustainable, low input, and debt-to-asset ratio. The gospel of get big or get out had been revealed as a lie. Richard Davenport disappeared for a while. I heard he was working on an oil rig in Oklahoma, trying to pay down his remaining debts. The toolbox I'd bought sat in a corner of my shop, a silent monument. One day, about 3 years after the auction, his old sedan pulled into my driveway. He got out. He was still thin, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. He looked weathered, but whole. "Frank," he said, nodding. "Rich," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag. We stood in silence for a moment. "I heard what you did," he said, looking over toward the 80 acres that had once been his. "And I heard you've been paying the taxes on it." "It's good land," I said. "Deserves to be taken care of." "I've got a little money saved," he said, not looking at me. "Not much, but I've got a job now, managing a big co-op down south. It's steady." He finally met my eyes. "I came to ask if you'd consider selling it back to me. I can't pay what it's worth, not yet. But I could make payments, a contract for deed." This was the moment I had been waiting for, the reason I had bought it. "I'm not a banker, Rich," I said. "I'll sell it back to you for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more. You pay me when you can. No interest." Tears welled in his eyes. He tried to speak but couldn't. He just nodded, his throat working. He reached out and shook my hand. His grip was strong, the grip of a man who had been to hell and back, and had somehow found his way home. My son David grew up through all of this. He was there the day I fixed the clutch on the 4020. He was there when the dust blew. He was there the day I bought the Davenport homestead. He worked beside me, learning the rhythms of the land, the language of the machines. When he was in his 20s, in the early 90s, he came to me in the shop. He was holding a glossy brochure. On the cover was a massive new tractor, a John Deere with more horsepower than a freight train, a cab full of computers, and a price tag that made my stomach clench. "Dad," he said, his eyes shining with the same ambition I had once seen in Richard Davenport's. "Look at this. We could replace both the 4020 and the 7700 combine with one of these. The dealer said we could cover twice the acres." I let him finish. Then I shut off the grinder I was using and turned to him. I walked him out of the shop and we stood there, looking out over our land. The fields were green and healthy. The fence rows were thick with wildlife. In the distance, we could see the old Davenport house, where Rich was now living again, a small plume of smoke rising from his chimney. "David," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder, "let me tell you a story about two men. One had a tractor so big he could barely turn it around, and the other had a tractor he could fix with his own two hands. The man with the big tractor ended up with nothing. The man with the old tractor is standing right here." I told him everything, about the promises, the easy credit, the hubris. I told him about the day of the auction, about the look on Rich's face. I wasn't telling him to be afraid of the future. I was telling him to respect the past. I was teaching him the difference between a tool and a trophy. "This farm," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "isn't just a business. It's our life. We don't owe any man a single dime for it. Every blade of grass, every bushel of corn is ours. That is a freedom bigger and more powerful than any tractor ever built. Don't you ever trade that freedom for a monthly payment." He looked at the brochure in his hand, then back at me. He slowly folded it and put it in his pocket. He understood. I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled and stiff. David runs most of the farm, and he runs it well. He's bought more land over the years, always paying cash, always waiting for the right opportunity. But I still come out to the shop, and sometimes, on a cool spring morning, I'll climb up onto the familiar seat of that old John Deere 4020. I'll turn the key, and that big six-cylinder will roar to life, settling into the same steady, reassuring rhythm I've known my whole life. It's the sound of survival, the sound of independence. It's the heartbeat of a legacy, paid for not with borrowed money, but with patience, with sweat, and with the hard-won wisdom that the shiniest things are often the most fragile. And as I pull the throttle back and let out the clutch, the old tractor rolls forward, ready for another season, a testament to the simple truth that the goal isn't to be the biggest. It's to be the last one standing.